Well, hello everybody and welcome. I am grateful to COABE that I'm here with you today and grateful that you have joined us. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and let's make sure, here we go. Today we're going to be talking about engaging our students' values. So I'm Carrie Stell. I am an instructor and instructional coach for Grayson College in Denison, Texas. That's in North Texas. My email is on the screen. I did want to make just a couple public service announcements before we get going. I wanted you to be aware that everything I say, my slide presentation and 6 handouts with links to each book, each website, each quote that I mention will be made available to you tomorrow. So if you like, you don't need to take notes because all that I have to share with you, you will have access to when you get that email. The other thing I wanted to mention is I'm not expecting to be in a position to check the chat box in real time. I would encourage you, however, to talk to each other. And if I mention a resource that you're familiar with and one that you appreciated, I'd love if you'd let each other know that. You can add your thumbs up to mine as I share many resources, many ideas with you today. I do hope to be able to stick around after our hour is up to make my way through our presentation. And if there are questions that anyone has that I have not managed to answer, I'd be very happy for you to mention that when our hour is up, because I'll be sticking around as long as anyone has questions for me. So we're going to be talking about engaging our students' values. I should mention to you that I am an adult basic and secondary education teacher. I teach high school equivalency course. My students here in North Texas are mostly preparing for taking the GED exam. What I'm about to talk about, I've done with my high school equivalency students. I believe much of what I'm talking about can also be useful and done in ESL classrooms. And I hope you'll agree with me after you've had a chance to hear what I have to share. So I would like to start with outcomes that I'm looking for in my classroom. I trust that you are as well. So I want to begin with the end in mind. I want to encourage and empower students, create classroom climates conducive to learning and growth, enable students to express their opinions and exercise their agency, promote teamwork and a sense of belonging, and assist students in persisting and achieving their goals. So that's what I'm aiming for. And this webinar, the objectives for this presentation, what I'll be talking about has helped me, and I hope it'll be helpful to you as well. So my objectives for this webinar, this presentation, is to discuss today how to lead students to identify their personal and classroom values, to brainstorm about actions and attitudes that can encourage or interfere with the identified classroom values, generate a list of action items students can agree to implement in the classroom, recommend resources and suggest lessons for focusing on values, and talk about how to turn any reading selection into practice for a high school equivalency test. You will be getting handouts. Again, emailed to you tomorrow. I've got 6 documents, 8 pages that you'll be receiving that address these specifically. I will be referencing those documents in our presentation today. So to begin, just exactly how do we identify our students' values? I began with a discussion and activity in my class where I asked my students, what does the word value mean to you? Of course, value has multiple meanings, and my students were quick to respond how much something costs, what you pay for an item. And so I needed to establish with my students that what we were talking about in our class at that time, that value is an intangible thing. It's a characteristic, a quality that matters to you, that's important to you. And then I asked them, what do you value? And as long as they knew I'm not talking about cars or computers or cell phones, we're talking about these quality and characteristics. I asked them, what values guide you? and explained my question this way: what qualities and ideas do you believe to be so important and true that they give your life meaning and direction? And I encouraged my students in the classroom. I'll even encourage you right now, if we were together in one room instead of on Zoom, I'd have you write down at least 5 qualities and ideas that are important to you, that give your life meaning and direction. So let me give you a few seconds to think about that and maybe jot something down. So after I gave my students time to reflect on this, we shared our lists with each other. Now, we didn't share, no one read all 5 or more items on their list at one time. What we did is we went around the room, and we were seated in a circle around the room. I had 9 students participated in this activity with me, and I shared as well. So there were 10 of us contributing to our discussion of the qualities and ideas that were important to us, the things that we value. And so I go to the first student, I asked them to share 1 item on their list. And then I went to the next student, and they shared 1 item on their list. And the next student shared 1 item on their list. And we went around the room many times as everyone had a chance to share a value that they held, 1 value at a time, until everyone had a chance to share their whole list. While students were sharing their values, I was at the computer and creating a document. I listed the values that students in my classroom shared. When another student shared a value that someone had already mentioned, I put a little tick mark next to it. So in this way, I not only kept track of the many values students in my class identified, I was able to keep track of which values were identified most often. Then, once we've done that with our personal values, what is important to you in your life and in your relationships, the next question I asked is, what values can we agree should guide all of us in our classroom? And again, I gave them time to write down at least 5 values that they wanted to practice to guide us in our classroom community. And you might choose to do that right now too. Think of things that are important to you, values that are important to you in your classrooms. And then again, we went around the room and everyone shared 1 of their values, 1 at a time, until everyone had shared. And again, I was at the computer creating a document, projecting it on a screen so that everyone could see and be reminded what mattered to us in the classroom, and kept track of what was mentioned the most. So I'm going to share with you this class where I was teaching in-person classes at the time. Was at Four Rivers Outreach in Sherman, Texas. It is an addiction outreach center to our community. And the following are 7 values suggested and agreed upon by students at Four Rivers Outreach in Sherman, Texas. I'm going to show you the list. Let me mention what happened in between. We spent about an hour talking about this on the first day of this activity. I went home that night and I was able to look at all the values, and there were dozens upon dozens and dozens of them. I chose the 7 that were mentioned repeatedly. So where multiple students referenced these values. So out of the 10 who contributed to this activity, including me, I added what I found valuable personally and in the classroom. I was able to narrow it down to 7. And these were the 7 items that the students and I identified as important to us in the classroom: encouragement, persistence, self-worth, teamwork, listening, respect, and focus. Also, at the end of our first discussion at night at home, when I was choosing the values, I was able to take what was said, what was shared as we talked about it. And again, we talked for an hour on this. People not only said what was important to them, they said why. And as I would type things up on the screen for people to see, you know, I type what they said, and people might say, no, I actually meant this, or other people would jump in and add to it. One of the things that was so wonderful about this discussion and this activity is, I might identify 5 or more values, but the person next to me might identify different values. And even if I didn't have those on my list, I'm able to recognize how valuable all values are. We were able to recognize how much we had in common, what matters to all of us. So it was an opportunity to get to know our classmates better and to be known better, to see what we had in common. What I did when I took all the notes that night and chose these, recognized that these 7 values were mentioned by classmates and me most often, I was able to come up with a definition or an explanation, how we were, what we meant when we said encouragement, what we meant when we said persistence. And again, these I'll call them definitions, but explanations of what we meant were taken from different things that different ones of us said in our discussion. And so I created a document. This is the first of 6 documents that you'll be getting emailed to you. I don't imagine you can see it very well on the screen. So what I'm going to do is share both the quality, the value, and then how we described it. And in addition to that, I want to share a quote from one of my favorite resources, passiton.com, just to do a quick survey of our values that my students and I identified. So the first one was encouragement. We defined it as we will lift each other up and give each other courage to carry on. And a quote from passiton.com. This comes from Elizabeth Harrison. Those who are lifting the world upward and onward are those who encourage more than criticize. I very often start with a quote at the beginning of class or at some point during class. And I love to ask students what they think about it. Do they agree with it? Has it been true in their lives? It's an opportunity to share and talk about it with each other, or to write on it. It can be a writing prompt as well. And they, whether they share it with anyone, whether they share it with us or not, they can recognize their thoughts, put it on paper or on a computer screen, and then they've got it for their own reference, or they can share it. So this is the first quote for encouragement. Our next value we identified was persistence, which we defined as we will strive to never quit trying to reach our goals. And a quote to exemplify that comes to us from Zig Ziglar. When obstacles arise, you change your direction to reach your goal. You do not change your decision to get there. I would ask students, what obstacles have you encountered in your life? How have you overcome them? How have you gone beyond them so that you can continue to reach your goals? Next value is self-worth. Whoops. Self-worth we defined as we will believe in ourselves because we are all worthy and valuable. And Beyonce agrees with that. Your self-worth is determined by you. You don't have to depend on someone telling you who you are. Our next value, teamwork. We will help each other to make progress and move toward our goals. And here's a quote from John Wooden. It is easier to reach our potential when we learn the value of including others in our quest. Listening. We will pay attention to each other in order to learn from each other. This accompanying quote comes from Sir Winston Churchill. Courage is what it takes to stand up and speak. Courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen. I love using quotes from historical individuals and using it as a jumping off point for jumping into a history lesson. And of course, if you're quoting Winston Churchill, that can be an entree into a lesson on World War II. Next, respect. We will treat each other the way we want to be treated because we want to care for each other. and an accompanying quote from Jackie Robinson, which could be used to introduce a lesson on civil rights. Jackie Robinson said, "I'm not concerned with your liking or disliking me. All I ask is that you respect me as a human being." And then our final value that we identified was focus, which we explained as we will make an effort to leave our issues and problems at the door as we enter our classroom, so we all can make progress toward our goals while we are here. And this quote comes to us from Dan Millman. "The secret of change is to focus all of your energy not on fighting the old, but on building the new." So all of these quotes and the lovely visuals that accompany them came from passiton.com, with one exception. I actually got the quote from another source for Jackie Robinson. So passiton.com, I will be referring to it repeatedly during this presentation, and I was only able to capture about half. They have identified, I counted them, more than 125 values. And they have thousands of quotes to that reflect these values. In fact, more than 4,000 quotes. And so whatever matters to you, whatever matters to your students, whatever students and you in your classrooms value, there will be quotes there at Pass It On for you that you could also use to introduce lessons. So that was what we did during our first hour, first discussion of this activity. When I came home and created that document, I shared the 7 values that we singled out and their definitions. So the second day, there was a second day of activity. And again, we spent about an hour on this. And the students brainstormed about these things, the following: positive things we do already to implement these values, additional things we can do to encourage growth of these values, and actions and attitudes that could interfere with these values. So those were the topics we were talking about. And I will tell you that the discussion was energetic, it was insightful, it was moving. My students inspired me in this conversation as we discussed it. And again, I went home, and as they're talking, as they're sharing, and I'm trying madly to write down everything they said because it was so moving and powerful for me. I went home that night and created another document. And so this is a document that it's the second of the 6 that I'm sharing with you that you will have emailed to you. Action items, a to-do list. And so these were things that my students talked about and agreed that they wanted to do in our class. And I will tell you on this list, and I will look at each item in a moment. I don't expect you to be able to read this here and now. Some of the items on this list were constants. They were things that I was already doing in my classroom. Some of them were things I had done, but I didn't do them regularly, and I may not have done them recently. And then some of the items were suggested by students. But here's the deal. All of the items were discussed and agreed upon by my students. So regardless of whether it was my idea or a student's idea, everyone had ownership in it. So the first item on the list, and because you're going to get this in an email, I may just say very little bit about it, each item. So begin class with a focus on values. Often I do that with a quote, and it may be just a few minutes, it may be many minutes as we talk about it. I will tell you my physical classrooms, the classes in a physical classroom before the pandemic were 4 hours long. My classes on Zoom these days, and still are virtual for at least for the time being, are only 2 hours long. So what I did this in a physical classroom. I use items from my to-do list. I've used things on my suggested lessons and activities list. I don't begin every class with a focus on values. I want to be truthful in advertising here, but I do as often as I can because I think it's meaningful even though my virtual students haven't chosen values for us to focus on. So begin class with a focus on values. Post a list of our classroom values for all to see and be reminded. That's something that's easier done in a physical classroom than online. I did give my students a copy of our values and our definitions, so they had a copy of their own. And one of the things we did is explain our classroom values to new students and how we strive to put them into practice. So one of my personal values is inclusiveness, and one of my classroom values is community. And in my physical classroom, when new students would join us, they didn't all join at once because we have a rolling enrollment and not managed enrollment. But as a new student would join us, I would have my veteran students, my current students, welcome new students by talking about why they're in this classroom, what they found in our classroom, and what they're planning to do, where they're going when they leave our classroom. I also had my current students talk about our values, this list, and we would give one to new students as well of the things we value in this class and how we're trying to put it into practice. So I will tell you, in my virtual classroom, I don't do that, but I do ask whenever I have a new student join, I do ask my current students to share something encouraging. What's something you've learned? Give us words of encouragement or advice to share with new students in my effort to create community, even in a virtual classroom. So the fourth action item on this to-do list is text or call absent students to check up on them and to let them know we miss them in class. So this is something I've been doing all along. A student suggested it. They actually suggested that we have a committee do this. I'm not sure that was such a good idea, and we didn't do that, but it gave me blanket permission to contact them via text. They knew to expect it, and individual students did exchange contact information and would just encourage each other to be there if they were absent. Fifth on our to-do list, have students say 3 positive things about themselves if they say anything negative about themselves. This was not my idea. Ashley Trevino is the director of our adult education program here in Grayson County in North Texas. And she actually visited my classroom a week before we had this discussion on values. And she mentioned that she did this, and it's a great idea. My students became the positivity police. So if any one of them, there was an occasion or two where I said something negative about myself, and they would jump on that in a nice way and say, now you need to say 3 positive things about yourself. And if students struggled with that, if that was hard for someone to say something positive about themselves, we would do it for them. 6th to-do list item. Teach reading and critical thinking skills while reading aloud selections focused on values. So I love to read aloud to my students. I want them to hear fluent reading. I want to model what effective readers do as we ask ourselves questions in order to comprehend what we're reading and to process the information. I also just want them to get excited about learning and reading something interesting, something important is the best way I know how to do that. So I do read aloud a lot. I do believe that you can teach reading and critical thinking skills while reading aloud anything. And if you're focused on values, things that are encouraging, or people who have overcome obstacles, we can do that and prepare for high school equivalency tests. I'm going to talk more about this and get a little more specific about how I do this in my classroom. So I'll return to this 6th item shortly. 7th item on the list, welcome students to share when they feel the need for some encouragement. So this needs to be done with care. We as teachers, our students don't want to get, well, maybe the students don't mind getting sidetracked so much, but we want to maintain our focus on academic goals. But as we talked about this, we recognize, the students and I, that it is rough out there, and adult students are having a hard time, and for goodness sakes, now more than ever, more than a year into a pandemic. So here's how we talked about it. Um, encourage students that if they're having a rough day to let it be known, and we wouldn't talk about details in class. That's for breaks, that's for after class, but people would pat them on the back. They'd say something affirming or encouraging. I was taught by a former director of our program, her adult ed program here in Grayson County. Donna Byram is her name, and she talked about telling her students to imagine all of their struggles, all of their problems, and to put it in a bag and leave that bag by the door and come on into the classroom and focus on what we need to focus on. The skills we need to learn in order to reach our academic goals. And as you do that, as you make progress, when it's time to leave, that bag is still there. Your problems, your issues, try as we might, we're not able to just walk away from them. We can't leave them at the door. Pick that bag back up. But it may not be so burdensome. It may not be so overwhelming if you've made progress for however many hours you've been in the classroom. You take your mind off of that while you're in the classroom, make some progress, and then as you leave, it can be encouraging. And then finally on our to-do list, the 8th item, close class with a focus on positive things that happened in class that day. So I imagine many of you have used exit tickets before. And before I did this activity, when I used exit tickets, I was focused on learning information, skills that students had learned in class that day, successes, academic successes that they'd experienced. But after these 2 sessions and conversations with my students focused on values, I would ask them either in writing or we could talk about, did they feel encouraged in class? What was encouraging them? Did they persist? Did they listen? Did they focus? Did they show respect to each other? Did they feel self-worth? So these are items, values that were important, identified as important to our class that we could close our class focused on. So I said that I was going to return to this, this item, teach reading and critical thinking skills while reading aloud selections focused on values. And this document will be emailed to you. It's the 3rd of the 6 documents that you will receive in your email tomorrow. This is what I use. I created this document in order to turn reading any selection into practice for high school equivalency tests. So what it is are more than 20 questions to ask while reading. And I've identified the skill and briefly explained it. I found when I was interrupting myself when I was reading out loud at the end of a paragraph and asking questions, I kept having to define what it means to draw a conclusion or make an inference or whatever it was I was asking them. I'd have to define it again and again and again. This doesn't prevent me from ever having to do that, but when I made copies of this and have given it to my students, both in classrooms, and physical classrooms, and in my virtual classrooms, it's something they can refer to. So as I ask the question, they can look for the skill and be reminded what it means. It's something they can use when they're reading anything on their own. So this is probably too small to read on the screen. So here's a summary, brief summary. The keywords that I explain in the more than 20 questions to ask while reading. So what's the context for this vocabulary word that you may or may not know? What's the connotation of a word? Is the meaning figurative or literal? Can you identify a synonym or an antonym for a given word? What's the main idea of this paragraph or this passage? What are the supporting details that the author uses to explain the idea? How would you summarize? What's a summary of what we've just read? How would you restate? What's a restatement of what we've just read? Is this explicitly stated? What's the implication? What is the author implying? What inference can you make? What can you infer from what we have just read? What conclusion can you come to? What's the sequence of events? Can you predict an outcome? What do you think will happen next? What's a cause of this effect and what's the effect? Can you compare or contrast these ideas? How are they similar or different? What's a figure of speech that's being employed? Is this a simile or a metaphor? What's the mood of this writing? What's the tone of the author? What's the theme of this passage? How would you describe this character? What's the author's purpose and position? Is this a fact or an opinion? What evidence does the author use to support his or her argument or opinion? What's an assumption that is being made? And what is a generalization? So all of these are reading and thinking skills. All of these have a brief explanation next to this document that I created that I'll be sharing with you, that COABE will be sharing with you in an email. So I want to recap what I've shared thus far. The discussion that helped me, two discussions that helped me to identify my students' values so we could focus on them in the classroom. And you too can ask your students, what does value mean? What do you value personally in your life and in your relationships? Then ask your students, what do you value in this class, in our learning community? Ask, why is it important to you? And how can we practice here? So we're going to talk about just exactly how we can implement our students' values. I have recommended resources. These are sources that I turn to time and again. It is the fourth of 6 documents that will be shared with you. I've mentioned Pass It On. I'll be mentioning it again. It's at the top of the list. Heroes for My Son and Heroes for My Daughter. Again, this document is too small. This is what you'll get in an email. Here's a summary of it. Heroes for My Son and Heroes for My Daughter by Brad Meltzer. These are resources. There are many, many others out there that will give you mini biographies. You can access them online. Whenever I'm talking about anything historical, especially if it's someone who's overcome struggles, someone who has made sacrifices for others in their lives. I love to highlight them, and I love to use it as an introduction, not only to the individuals, but to their times. And these are a couple of books that I often use for that. This Day in History at history.com. I suggest getting their daily emails. Because I will use that as an introduction. What was going on this day or during this week, during any given year, as an introduction to certain historical events. TED Talks at TED.com. I imagine many of you are aware of and may have used, but there are also articles where the good people at TED take the talks and turn them into articles that you can read. Ideas.TED.com, and there are educational video lessons at ed.ted.com. And I'm a NPR listener, and I find that I can find some new science, health, culture, and human interest stories that exemplify values that I've used with some frequency from that site. So again, a few sources for recommended resources. So now the next document I'll be sharing with you is actually the 5th of 6 documents. It's a 3-pager. The first page, these are suggested reading selections, videos, and activities that you can use, that you can check out for engaging your students' values. The first page, we're focusing on encouragement and persistence. And for each of those values, I've highlighted 3 lesson ideas and with links, so that if you decide this is something you want to try with your students, you'll have easy access to it once you get this in the email. At this point, I'm going to need to say less instead of more. I want to make sure I get all the information out there before our time is up. So I won't say a lot about everything. I'll say a little bit more. I'm going to highlight several of these activities. For starters, let's talk about encouragement. So encouragement, to remind you, we described it as we will lift each other up and give each other courage to carry on. So the first suggested lesson is a TED Talk. You may notice that this is 17 minutes long. I wouldn't play a TED Talk that's 17 minutes long in its entirety, at least not in one sitting. I did share this over 2 class periods. Why we all need to practice emotional first aid. So many of our values involve feelings, feeling encouraged, feeling self-worth, feeling motivated. And in this TED Talk, psychologist Guy Winch talks about the need to take good care of our emotions as well as our physical bodies. And so I appreciated this talk very much. One of the things I do when I share a TED Talk, you may be aware that you can click on transcript and you could make a copy of that. I typically copy the transcript and make a document of that. And I always make sure I'll show a TED Talk so we can just watch it and glean what we can from the talk. But then I will pass out, at least in my classroom, I give students a hard copy of it, or put it up on a screen. In virtual classrooms, I need to give them, put it up on a screen so that they can actually reread what we've just heard and dive in a little deeper. That's when at the end of a paragraph, you can ask any of those more than 20 questions to help them focus on information that's been shared, and also start becoming more accustomed to the kinds of questions you will be asked on a high school equivalency test. So after sharing this TED Talk, I suggest this article. Ideas.ted.com has an article on 7 ways to practice emotional first aid. It's also based on information from a psychologist, Guy Winch. So the first activity is why to practice emotional first aid. The second activity is a how to. What I'd really like to focus on right now is to tell you about, if you've not heard, about a story that's made the rounds. It is the I Can't funeral. And I first heard this story. It is online. You may have heard it yourself. I first heard about the I Can't funeral in the original Chicken Soup for the Soul book. There are many editions of this book for many different audiences, but the original had this story. Rest in peace, the I Can't funeral. So if I can briefly, I won't read the story to you, but I'll briefly tell you. It's a story of a 4th grade teacher who was participating in a staff development project. And she was being observed by someone who was putting on the staff development, observed her in her classroom. And when he walked in and sat down, he noticed that students were writing and they were filling up pages. And he walked up and down the aisle and realized students were making a list of things that they can't do. I can't, and then they would make long lists, fill a page and sometimes more. They did this for 10 minutes and the teacher did it too. The observer, the staff development observer wondered, why are they focused on the negative? Why are they focused on things they can't do instead of the positive? He didn't ask, and then he found out. This very wise teacher gathered up all of the lists, put the lists in a shoebox, took the students outside, gave them a shovel, had them dig a hole 3 feet deep, and they buried their I can'ts. They had a funeral for I can't. And after the teacher said some words eulogizing I can't, they went back in and they had a party. They also made a brown paper tombstone so they could rest in peace, encourage I Can't to rest in peace. And so those students in the future, obviously a very memorable exercise. And they could point to the tombstone and they could remind each other if a student said, I can't do this or I can't do that. Oh no, we buried it. Yes, indeed you can, and you will. So I did this with my adult students. I read the story. Partway through, I tell you in the document you'll be receiving where I stopped and where I had my students start filling out a page or more of things that they can't do. I did it myself. I had a cardboard candy box, heart-shaped candy box that we put our I can't lists in. We went outside. This was at Four Rivers, the outreach center. And we dug a hole, we buried our box right there by a bush near the entry into the building. And I will tell you, I very often would walk into that building and recall that we had buried I Can't. And the students who were present that day recalled and not only reminded me, but reminded others that in our classroom, we've buried I Can't, because we can. So next on the list, the next value is persistence. We will strive to never quit trying to reach our goals. So I've mentioned passiton.com as a source for quotes. It's also a source for videos, public service announcements, billboards. This billboard highlights, you may have seen some along a highway. This one highlights Alfred Williams. He couldn't read this until 70. Literacy, pass it on. So what I would love to do right now is, well, first off, I'll tell you, I do mention in the handout that there's a backstory to Alfred Williams. He didn't learn to read as a child. And they tell you why, and they tell you how he came to learn to read. It was a first grade teacher who noticed that he was listening at the door as she was instructing first graders. Her name is Miss Hamilton. I'm not going to tell you anymore. I'm going to encourage you to access the links to read the story. You cannot read about Alfred without falling in love with him. What I would like to take the time to do right now is go ahead and play the beginning minutes of this 5-minute video and the last minute. So this is Alfred, and this is Miss Hamilton.
I tell people you're never too old to learn. Look at me, I'm 74 years old.
Never too late.
Never too late, that's what I put up on the wall. Never too late to learn, and it's not. I carried 3 kids to school every day and had to pick them up, and I was listening at the teachers when I go pick them up. I wouldn't just walk in the room, but I'd stand by with the door cracking, and I heard how Miss Hamilton was teaching her class. One day she wanted to know why I didn't bring the kids to different sessions that they have for kids, and I said, well, Miss Hamilton, I can't read. She said, well, maybe I can help you. I said, well, I'd like for you to. She said, okay. Tomorrow I'm gonna see what you know.
I knew if he could get into the classroom and just be exposed to all of that print that he'd missed out on, that he would soak it in.
Hour after kids would get out of school, she would stay over and teach me to read.
He started coming in the mornings, and we got him some rides to get to school, and I knew then, after a week, he was dedicated, he was a learner, and I never knew how dedicated he would be, but we tutored all summer long, and he would come back every day. Sometimes we would stay an hour, sometimes we'd stay 3 hours, but he couldn't get enough of learning, and I couldn't get enough of him learning.
And now I can read books after books after books after books.
Are you still learning, Alfred, every day?
Every day I go to school,
learning.
I still learn. Because learning to me is a gift that somebody's offering me.
I'm going to pause it there and fast forward through the video, play the last minute. I will tell you that that summer, Miss Hamilton began teaching Alfred how to read, and then he enrolled in first grade. But after that first year, he continued coming back to her classroom and served as a volunteer in first grade. So he remained in the first grade classroom. I gather that he was also working on getting his GED. I will tell you the sad news that since this time, Alfred has passed away. If you're going to read the backstory, you'll hear about that. Let me go ahead. I'm going to take you to the end. Let's see. We'll listen to the last minute of this.
Happening to me.
Alfred and I will sometimes argue about who is blessed. He says he's the most blessed because he gets to come to first grade. I know that I'm the one that's most blessed because, I've always known as a teacher that I changed lives, but I never realized that it was that this is how you can change lives. And I know it's changed your life. I know that I've helped him just to be what he is now, and that's what we all do. That's what teachers are. And for some reason, God brought Alfred to my door.
I want people to remember me by being a man not to give up. If you start something, finish it. And that's where I want them to remember me, as a man that didn't give up. Don't quit.
Alfred Williams, a man that didn't give up, a man that didn't quit, and teachers. Literacy. Pass it on. Next, under persistence. Okay, here we go. This is an illustrated children's book. I have used children's books in my adult ed classes, especially love the idea of using them with ESL students. Sadly, we don't have time to look at any of the pages of this book. Emmanuel's Dream, the true story, it is a true story of Emmanuel Ofosu Yeboah, who cycled across Ghana in West Africa. And this is nearly 400 miles in 10 days. And he only had one strong leg. And he had a message that he spread that disability does not mean inability, and that one leg is enough to do great things and one life can change the world. Persistence. The third activity I've highlighted under persistence is Maya Angelou, reciting her poem, Still I Rise. I would play this. You get to see the lines from her poem on the screen. Ask students, what their favorite lines were, how it spoke to you. And then I give them a copy so we could dive in a little deeper. And this is when you can whip out more than 20 questions, and you can ask them for the meaning of words, and if they recognize similes and metaphors or implications and inferences, tone, mood, a theme in a poem. It doesn't have to, even though on the GED they no longer have poems, but you can use poems to ask those kinds of questions. So the second page on this document that you'll be receiving focuses on self-worth, teamwork, and listening. Self-worth. The first activity that I've highlighted is a video of girls from around the world as they are dancing and lip syncing to Beyonce singing, "I'ma keep running 'cause a winner don't quit on themselves." As the girls are lip syncing and dancing, facts about issues that affect women and girls are displayed on the screen. It was in fact created for the International Day of the Girl. Very powerful, great song, by the way, and very powerful video. I hope you'll have a chance to check it out. Next, under self-worth. So this is an article from psychologytoday.com, and it discusses what self-esteem is. The next article comes from ideas.ted.com, and this is our old friend, psychologist Guy Winch, who describes ways that we can build ourselves up. An excellent read with adult students. What I really want to highlight, though, however, is the last lecture. So the last lecture was the first book I read aloud, one short chapter at a time. I started reading aloud to my students. Actually, I had recognized that my students, mostly the young ones, would go on a 10-minute break and come back 15 or 20 minutes later. So I knew I needed to do something right after the break that would draw them in. And this is what I did, and it did indeed do that. Randy Pausch, if you're familiar with this book, was a computer science professor at Carnegie Mellon. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and given months to live. He lived 9 months. During that time, he gave a last lecture. He wrote this book before he passed. So this book is an emotional read. and it can be triggering for students. I will tell you, when I was reading this book, I had a 16-year-old student, a young woman in my class at the time. And as I was reading at one point, she got up and walked out. And when I spoke to her when class was over, she shared with me that she'd had a boyfriend who had recently died from a motorcycle accident. And obviously, you know, I got it. But she told me after the next class that she'd gone to the bookstore and she'd actually bought this book because she wanted to read it. She just wanted to read it on her own terms. So the last lecture by Randy Pausch. There is a chapter that I highlight in here. I've read the whole book. I don't do that these days because there's so many good books, so many good chapters out there. The chapter I've highlighted is chapter 7. It's entitled, "I Never Made It to the NFL." And let me share a quote from that chapter. Self-esteem, it's not something you can give. It's something they have to build. There was really only one way to teach kids how to develop it. You give them something they can't do. They work hard until they find they can do it. And you just keep repeating the process. And what's true for kids is true for you and me. It's true for adults as well. So Randy Pausch, he wrote the book on living while dying. Motivation. Pass it on. The next value I have suggestions for you is for teamwork. So teamwork. This one I've never been able to do in a virtual classroom, but it sure was fun in an actual classroom, the marshmallow challenge, where students are given a marshmallow, masking tape, dry spaghetti noodles, a yard of string, and they are challenged to collaborate, to work together, and to build the tallest structure. After doing this, I shared this TED Talk about build a tower, build a team. A short video, you can watch it and then you can print this transcript and look more closely at what Ted Wujak has to say about it. And it's interesting. There's a surprising group, graduates, recent graduates from kindergarten, who always beat the average and who typically do better than recent graduates from business school. So it's a great activity. It's an interesting video. I would love to talk for a minute about current news events. This was one at the time when I share it that was current. Rip current swept away a Florida family. Then beachgoers formed a human chain. So there were 10 swimmers in the water, and one was as old as 67 and one was as young as 8, and they were swept away by a riptide. And they were rescued by more than 80 people who formed a human chain. I'd love to read a quote from the article. It was actually one of the rescuers posted this on Facebook after the event. She said, "To see people from different races and genders come into action to help total strangers is absolutely amazing to see. People who didn't even know each other went hand in a line into the water to try and reach them. Pause and just imagine that." And when you read the article with students, you don't have to imagine it because they describe it, and they were rescued. An amazing story. I will mention passiton.com now has current events news stories on their site as well. And so, you know, if not this story, there are others that you can use. So the next section is on listening, and I'm need to speed up in our final minutes. And again, everything that I was going to say, plan to say is in the document that you'll be getting. So the first article on listening is How to Be a Good Listener. It comes from US News, health.usnews.com. The second resource on listening is a chapter from Reviving Ophelia. The 13th chapter is What I've Learned from Listening. She's an author of many books and a clinical psychologist. And I adored this chapter about what I've learned from listening. Questions she asks her adolescent girls that she counsels. And she says, "I believe that talking to a listener with an accepting, empathetic, and non-judgmental stance is healing." Her questions that she asks her clients are wonderful writing prompts, which, you know, it's therapeutic to write, and your students may want to do it and not share it with you or not share it with anyone. But I see value in that, not just therapeutically, but academically. When we put our ideas in our head into words on paper or on a computer. There's value in that. The last resource I'm mentioning is another beautiful illustrated children's book. If I had to pick a favorite of all time, this may be it. The Rabbit Listened. So something sad happens to Taylor, and then all the animals think they know how to help Taylor, and they tell him what he should do, but their advice doesn't help, and nothing that they say helps. Nothing makes him feel better until the rabbit arrives, and the rabbit listened. I love these 3 resources because you can see what a news reporter has to say about how to be a good listener. You can see what a clinical psychologist says, and then you can see this beautiful children's book that's saying the same thing that even a child can understand. The final page of this 3-page document talks about respect and focus. The first activity I highlighted under respect was a very powerful spoken word poem, To This Day by Shane Koizan, about bullying, shaming, and surviving that. It was a viral video first, and there were 80 animators who animated it. It was crowdsourced. And then it's a TED Talk as well. There are links to that in the handout that you'll be getting emailed. So then I have multiple suggestions for talking about Nelson Mandela, starting with this quote: "For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others." And of course, when you quote Nelson Mandela, you need to talk about his being in prison for 27 years because he opposed apartheid, the legal racial segregation and discrimination against Blacks in South Africa. How, when he was set free, how he was able to negotiate an end to it, how he was the first president freely elected, the first freely elected president in South Africa. There's a quote here from Norman Vincent Peale, because I share an article that talks about how the writings of Norman Vincent Peale inspired Nelson Mandela when he was in prison. And then the final focus, the final value we focused on was focus. And I share a news report on Nightline, Dan Harris, who had an on-air panic attack while he was delivering the news. And he talked about how meditation helped him. And this article can help you and your students, 3 meditation techniques for beginners. So that was, I sped up at the end. Again, I hope you'll have a chance to look at what I have in writing for you. Let's pause for a reality check. And a quote from Colin Powell: "A dream doesn't become reality through magic. It takes sweat, determination, and hard work." And so your mission, should you choose to accept it, is focus on one value, one that's important to you. Share a quote for your students to discuss. Use one of the suggested reading selections or activities in your classroom. Then you can decide if you want to lead your students in identifying their classroom values. And if you do, I'd just be delighted if you'd reach out to me. Here's my email again. I'd love to hear about it. And I'd love to close with a couple more quotes. "But where was I to start? The world is so vast. I shall start with the country I know best, my own. But my country is so very large. I had better start with my town. But my town too is large. I had best start with my street. No, my home. No, my family. Never mind. I shall start with myself." This is from Elie Wiesel, Holocaust survivor, about making a difference, pass it on. And another advertisement, another quote advertising making a difference, from Barbara Mikulski: "Each one of us can make a difference. Together, we make a change." All of these quotes will be in your final handout that you get emailed. And finally, I want to go back to the beginning. This is where we started. This is one of the most effective ways I found to achieve these outcomes that I'm looking for in my classroom, to encourage and empower students, to create classroom climates conducive to learning and growth, to enable students to express their opinions and exercise their agency, to promote teamwork and a sense of belonging, to assist students in persisting in achieving their goals. So I thank you all for being here and allowing me to share something that has been so meaningful for me and my students. I'll even call it sacred. And I hope you got something that you can use with your students and that you found it valuable. So have a great day. I'm going to stick around. If anyone has questions at this point, I think I will stop sharing shortly. There's my email. So you can email questions and comments. I'm going to stop sharing and take a look at the chat box. So if anyone sticks around and if they have a question they want to type in, I'd be delighted to take a look at that. So, okay, I'm not going to rewind the chat box. Actually, I'll have access to it later. But if anyone has questions, go ahead and type it in. We can chat. Thank you for thanking me. I appreciate it, folks. Oh, here's a poll. Please let us know if this professional development webinar met your expectations. Well, I'm going to say it exceeded my expectations. I guess my vote counts too. Oh, host and panelists cannot vote. Okay, so anyway, I'm taking a look. Okay. Don't hesitate to email if you do have questions. Oh, I'm so sorry. I see someone's had technical difficulties. Yes, a recording will be available. It's my understanding. I see they are recording it. And just to repeat what I said initially, you will be getting an email about 24 hours or so. Hard to beat a quote from Colin Powell. I agree. Yeah. Thank you all for sharing my my passion for values and for students, for adult students. It was a joy for me to be able to present today, and I appreciate your being here. So thank you all. Don't see any more questions. I'll be eager to go back and read over the chat. Wow. Here's a Kat, I don't know if you're still here. Value is also part of the definition of assessment. Students understand, evaluate better than. Wow. Beautiful point. Love that. It's fun to see where y'all are from too. Okay, folks, I think this may be goodbye. I will be looking at your chat messages after the fact, and I will be grateful if you email me. So thank y'all. James, I think we're done.